The first time Isaiah Blackwood stepped into Whispering Pines, 3 men died before anyone could tell him her name. The undertaker said it was the quietest killing he'd ever witnessed. No screams, no pleas, just the whisper of steel leaving. Leather and 3 bodies hitting sawdust floors like autumn leaves. The townfolk would later say Blackwood hadn't even looked angry, just patient, like a man waiting for an answer to a simple question. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name, he'd asked again, revolver still warm in his hand, voice soft as church prayer. Just her name. The bartender, trembling so hard he nearly dropped the glass he was polishing, finally whispered, Eleanor Winters. And that was all Blackwood needed to hear. But our story doesn't start there. It starts 3 months earlier when Eleanor Winters was just the spinster seamstress who lived at the edge of Whispering Pines, a woman folks barely remembered to nod to on Sundays. Whispering Pines sat tucked between mountains that caught the wind just right, creating an endless sighing sound that gave the town its name. It wasn't a bad place, not really, just a place where people minded their business and kept to their stations. The kind of place where a woman without family or fortune learned to walk small and speak smaller. Eleanor Winters had been walking small for 32 years. She lived in a crooked little house behind the church, its roof permanently tilted, like a hat worn askew. The townspeople brought her their mending and their alterations, their wedding dresses and their funeral suits. She took them all with the same quiet nod, her thin fingers already mapping the stitches she would make. Eleanor had a face that was easy to forget. Not ugly, precisely, just unremarkable. Brown hair pulled back so severely it seemed to pull the life from her eyes. Skin pale as unbleached cotton from years spent indoors, hunched over needle and thread. She wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, all in shades that matched the dust outside her door. Plain as porridge, Mrs. Sullivan often remarked at the weekly sewing circle that Eleanor was never invited to join. And twice as cold. What the women of Whispering Pines didn't know was that Eleanor watched them through her windows as they passed. She knew their secrets stitched into the clothes they brought her, the letting out of waistbands before announcements were made, the careful mending of tears that came from fights no one mentioned, the perfume stains on collars from embraces that weren't with spouses. Her fingers knew their stories better than their own tongues did. On this particular Tuesday morning, Eleanor was working on Judge Harmon's daughter's wedding dress when the door to her shop creaked open. The bell she'd hung there years ago had long since lost its clapper, but she'd grown accustomed to the particular groan of the hinges. "Be with you in a moment," she murmured without looking up, her needle flashing in and out of ivory satin. "No rush, Miss Winters." The deep voice made her start. It wasn't one she recognized, and in Whispering Pines, that was unusual enough to make her look up. The man who stood in her doorway seemed too large for the space, as if her little shop had suddenly shrunk. He wore a black duster despite the summer heat, its hem brushing the tops of boots that had seen many miles. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes she couldn't quite make out, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the slight silver threading through his dark beard. And the gun. Impossible not to notice the gun, slung low on his hip like it belonged. There more than his own hand did. "I don't believe we've met," Eleanor said, setting down her work carefully. Strangers meant new measurements, new patterns, new coins in the jar she kept buried in her garden. "We haven't. Name's Sullivan, Thomas." "Sullivan." He removed his hat, revealing eyes the color of thunderclouds. "I'm looking for a vest, something sturdy but fine enough for special occasions." Eleanor nodded, already reaching for her measuring tape. This was safe territory. "I can do that. Will take about 2 weeks, if that suits." "It does." She gestured to a small platform beside the long mirror in the corner. "If you wouldn't mind." The man, Sullivan, moved with the grace of someone always aware of potential danger. As he shrugged off his duster, Eleanor caught sight of scars on his hands. White lines that spoke of violence survived. She said nothing, simply began taking measurements with a practiced efficiency. "You've been in Whispering Pines long?" he asked, standing perfectly still as she worked. "All my life." She stretched the tape across his shoulders, 42 inches. "And you're always alone?" The question made her fingers falter. "I'm sufficient unto myself, Mr. Sullivan." Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "Aren't we all?" he said, though it didn't sound like he believed it. When she finished, Eleanor wrote the measurements in her leather-bound book, the pages worn soft with years of use. "I'll need a deposit. Half now, half upon completion." Sullivan reached into his pocket and placed not half but the full amount on her table. The coins gleamed in the dusty light slanting through her windows. "I'll be back in 2 weeks then," he said, donning his hat once more. He paused at the door. "Miss Winters, do you ever attend the social gatherings in town? The dances at the hotel, perhaps?" Eleanor nearly pricked her finger in surprise. No one had asked her such a thing in years. "No, Mr. Sullivan. My work keeps me occupied." He nodded as if he'd expected this answer. "Shame. Good day to you, then." The door creaked shut behind him, and Eleanor stood for several minutes staring at the space he had occupied. Something about Thomas Sullivan unsettled her, like a stitch pulled too tight that would eventually pucker the fabric. She returned to the wedding dress, but her usual precision faltered. 3 times she had to unpick her work. By the time darkness fell, her eyes were strained and her back ached more than usual. She lit the oil lamp and made herself a simple supper of bread and cheese, eating it at her workbench as she always did. Outside, Whispering Pines prepared for sleep. The saloon would be lively for hours yet, but the respectable establishments had already closed their doors. Eleanor could hear the wind in the pines, its constant murmur, the only lullaby she'd known since her father died 15 years ago. The knock at her door startled her so badly she knocked over her cup of tea. No one called after dark. It wasn't done. Eleanor stood slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She picked up the small knife she used for cutting thread and held it behind her skirts as she approached the door. "Who's there?" Her voice sounded thin even to her own ears. "Eleanor, it's Reverend Matthews. Please, I need your help." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Reverend Matthews was one of the few people in town who treated her with genuine kindness. She unbolted the door and opened it to find him standing there, face pale in the moonlight, his collar askew. "Reverend, what's wrong? May I come in? Please, it's urgent." She stepped aside, noting the unusual agitation in his normally calm demeanor. "Of course. Are you injured?" No. He paced into her small sitting room, hat clutched in his hands. "It's Mary. Mary Matthews was the Reverend's daughter, a sweet girl of 17 with golden curls and a smile that lit up the church on Sundays. Unlike most in town, she always made a point to greet Eleanor warmly. "What about Mary?" Eleanor asked, setting her knife on the side table. "She's gone missing." The words tumbled out in a rush. "She went for a walk after supper, she often does, but she hasn't returned. It's been hours, Eleanor. My wife is beside herself." Eleanor frowned. "Have you alerted Sheriff Wilson?" "Yes, he's gathering men to search, but..." He twisted his hat brim. "There's something else, something I haven't told anyone yet." The Reverend sank into her single armchair, suddenly looking much older than his 50 years. "Mary had a letter. I found it in her room after she disappeared. It was from Judge Harmon's son, Richard." Eleanor knew Richard Harmon well enough. or rather knew the alterations she'd made to his jackets to accommodate his widening girth as he indulged his appetites for both food and drink. A man of 30 who still lived off his father's reputation and fortune. What did the letter say? She asked, though she could guess. He asked her to meet him tonight, said he had something important to give her. Reverend Matthews looked up, his eyes wet. Eleanor, Richard Harmon has been pursuing my daughter for months. I've forbidden it. He's too old for her too. Dissolute, but Mary is young, impressionable. She thinks his attention is romantic. Eleanor's mouth thinned to a line. She knew better than most what men like Richard Harmon wanted from girls like Mary Matthews. You think she went to meet him? I'm certain of it, but she should have been back hours ago. And when I went to the Harmon house to confront them, their housekeeper said Richard had gone to Broken Spoke for the evening with some friends. The Reverend's voice broke. Broken Spoke, Eleanor. That place is no better than a brothel. What if he took her there? What if he wouldn't dare? Eleanor said with more conviction than she felt. Not the Reverend's daughter, but even. As she spoke, she remembered the silk handkerchiefs she'd mended for Richard Harmon, the ones with different women's initials embroidered in the corners. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The button she'd sewn back onto his shirt that didn't match the others, because the original had been torn off in haste, she'd wager. I need to join the search, Reverend Matthews said, standing abruptly. But I wanted to ask if you'd stay with Sarah tonight. She shouldn't be alone, and she trusts you. Eleanor nodded. Of course, let me gather a few things. As she packed a small bag with her sewing kit, she always brought it, a habit formed from years of finding comfort in the rhythm of needle and thread. She glanced out her window toward the road that led out of town, toward the settlement known as Broken Spoke. It wasn't really a town, just a collection of buildings that catered to men's baser instincts, gambling, liquor, and women. The thought of sweet Mary Matthews in such a place made Eleanor's stomach turn. She grabbed her shawl and followed the Reverend out into the night. Sarah Matthews was indeed beside herself when Eleanor arrived at the parsonage. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually neat hair falling in strands around her face as she paced the parlor. Eleanor, she sobbed, clutching at Eleanor's hands. Mary, my little girl. They'll find her, Eleanor said, guiding the distraught woman to the sofa. The whole town will be looking. But as the night wore on and no word came, Sarah eventually collapsed into exhausted sleep, her head on Eleanor's lap. Eleanor sat awake, staring out the window at the moon tracking its slow path across the sky. Her fingers worked automatically, mending a tear in one of the Reverend's shirts she'd found in a basket by the hearth. It was nearly dawn when the door burst open. Both women startled awake to find Sheriff Wilson standing there, his expression grim beneath his mustache. Mrs. Matthews, he said, removing his hat, we found her. Sarah let out a sound like a wounded animal. Is she? She's alive, the sheriff said quickly, but not well. The doctor's with her now. Where? Sarah was already on her feet, reaching for her shawl. Where is my daughter? At Doc Miller's place. Reverend's there too. Eleanor helped Sarah with her shawl, then hesitated. Her presence wouldn't be needed now. She'd returned to her little house and the wedding dress waiting on her table, but Sarah grabbed her hand. Come with me, Eleanor, please. And so Eleanor found herself walking through the grey light of early morning, supporting Sarah Matthews. As they hurried toward the doctor's house at the other end of town, already curtains were twitching as whispering pines woke to the news. Doc Miller's house smelled of carbolic acid and coffee. He met them in the hallway, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a smudge of something dark on his apron that Eleanor tried not to identify. She's resting, he said softly. "Reverence with her." "What happened to her?" Sarah demanded, her voice breaking. "Tell me what happened to my child." The doctor glanced at Eleanor, then back to Sarah. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "Eleanor stays," Sarah insisted, gripping Eleanor's hand so tightly the bones shifted. Doc Miller sighed. "Very well. Mrs. Matthews, your daughter was found at Broken Spoke. She'd been mistreated, drugged, I believe, with laudanum, and interfered with." The meaning was clear enough. Sarah swayed on her feet and Eleanor tightened her arm around the woman's waist. "Who?" Sarah whispered. "Who did this to her?" "She hasn't been able to tell us much. She's still confused from the laudanum, but she did say Richard Harmon's name." Sarah pulled away from Eleanor suddenly, her grief transforming into something harder, sharper. "I want to see the judge. Now." "Mrs. Matthews, perhaps you should see to Mary first. My husband is with Mary. I want justice for my daughter." The doctor and sheriff exchanged glances. "Judge Harmon isn't likely to," Sheriff Wilson began. "I don't care what's likely," Sarah cut in. "My daughter is lying in there ruined, and his son is responsible. I want to look that man in the eye." Eleanor watched the transformation with a sense of foreboding. Sarah Matthews had always been a gentlewoman, the kind who brought soup to the sick and never said an unkind word. But now something fierce had awakened in her, something that made the men in the room shift uncomfortably. "I'll take you," Eleanor said quietly. All three turned to look at her in surprise. "It's not your concern, Miss Winters," the sheriff began. "I'm making it my concern." Eleanor's voice was calm, steady. "Mrs. Matthews shouldn't go alone, and the Reverend should stay with Mary." Before anyone could object further, she guided Sarah out the door and into the street. The town was fully awake now, people gathering in small clusters, voices hushed as they passed. Eleanor kept her eyes straight ahead, her spine stiff as a steel rod. Judge Harmon's house stood on the hill overlooking the town, a two-story affair, with white columns and a wraparound porch. It was the grandest house in Whispering Pines, built with money from back east and maintained with the proceeds of justice tilted in favor of those who could pay. Eleanor had never entered through the front door before. Her business had always been conducted through the servants' entrance, bringing altered clothing to the housekeeper. But today she marched Sarah Matthews right up the front steps and rang. The bell. The housekeeper who answered took one look at their faces and tried to close the door. "The judge isn't receiving visitors." Sarah threw her shoulder against the door, surprising the woman with her strength. "He'll receive me." They pushed past the stammering housekeeper into the grand foyer with its polished wood and imported carpet. Sarah's voice rang out, echoing off the high ceiling. "Judge Harmon! Judge Harmon! Come down here this instant!" Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. This was madness. The judge was the most powerful man in the county. He could destroy them both with a word. But when Augustus Harmon appeared at the top of the stairs in his dressing gown, she found herself standing taller rather than shrinking back. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" the judge demanded, his jowls quivering with indignation. "Your son," Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. "Your son took my daughter to Broken Spoke last night. He drugged her. He violated her. She's 17 years old." The judge's face remained impassive. "These are serious accusations, Mrs. Matthews. Where is your proof?" "My daughter's word is proof enough for me, but not for the law." The judge descended the stairs slowly. "Richard is a grown man from a respected family. Your daughter is—" "What? A reverend's child with romantic notions. Perhaps she followed him willingly." Sarah lunged forward, and Eleanor had to catch her arm. "How dare you? My Mary is a virtuous, honest girl. And my son is a Harmon," the judge replied coldly. "Now I suggest you leave before you say something that might be construed as slander. Sheriff Wilson is a close friend, you know." Eleanor felt something shift inside her, like a gear long rusted suddenly turning. All the years of sidelong glances, of whispers behind hands, of being overlooked and underestimated, it crystallized, in that moment, into perfect clarity. "A Harmon," she repeated, her voice so calm it surprised even her. "Yes, I know your family well, Judge. I know how you had your suits altered to hide the weight you've gained from drinking too much port after dinner. I know your wife's dresses have to be let out, not because she's getting stouter, but because she binds her ribs so tightly they're becoming misshapen." The judge's face flushed dark red. "How dare you!" "And I know your son Richard," Eleanor continued, stepping forward. "I know he tears his clothes in very particular ways. I know he comes home with substances on his cuffs that a gentleman shouldn't encounter. I know he's had 3 watches in the past year because he keeps gambling them away." "Get out of my house," the judge hissed. "I know everything about this town that no one thinks to hide from plain, forgettable Eleanor Winters," she said, her voice gaining strength, "including how you rule on cases depending on who offers you the better gift afterward." The judge raised his hand as if to strike her, but Eleanor didn't flinch. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Add assault to your family's sins this morning." His hand hovered in the air between them, trembling with rage. Behind them, the housekeeper gasped. "You will regret this," he said finally, lowering his arm. "Both of you. No one threatens a Harmon in his own home." "And no one hurts Mary Matthews without answering for it," Sarah replied, finding her voice again. "If you won't give us justice, we'll find it elsewhere." The judge's laugh was cold. "Where? I am the law in Whispering Pines." "Then perhaps we need to look beyond Whispering Pines," Eleanor said. They left, the judge's threats following them down the manicured path. Eleanor's hands were shaking by the time they reached the street, but her spine remained straight. She had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county, and for what? A moment of righteousness that would surely be punished. Yet she couldn't regret it. Not when she saw the look of fierce gratitude in Sarah Matthews's eyes. "Thank you," Sarah whispered as they walked back toward the doctor's house. "No one has ever stood up to him like that." Eleanor shook her head. "It won't change anything. It already has." But the cost became apparent all too quickly. By that afternoon, as Eleanor sat with Mary, the girl pale and silent in the doctor's spare bed, Sheriff Wilson arrived with a summons. Eleanor was to appear before the judge the next morning to answer charges of slander and disturbing the peace. "He can't do this," Reverend Matthews protested. Eleanor was defending our daughter's honor. "He's the judge," Sheriff Wilson said with an apologetic shrug. "He can do pretty much what he wants." That night, Eleanor returned to her little house behind the church to find her door standing open. Inside, chaos awaited her. Her fabrics had been slashed, her patterns scattered, her furniture overturned. On the wall, someone had scrawled in what looked like coal. "Whore lover." Eleanor stood in the wreckage of her life's work, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The wedding dress she'd been working on lay in tatters on the floor. Judge Harmon's daughter would need a new seamstress. She bent down slowly and began to gather what could be salvaged. There wasn't much. As she worked, she heard a footstep in the doorway and looked up to find Thomas Sullivan standing there, taking in the destruction with those storm cloud eyes. "Miss Winters," he said, removing his hat. "I heard what happened." Eleanor straightened, suddenly conscious of her rumpled appearance. News travels fast in Whispering Pines. Not fast enough, it seems. He stepped inside, careful not to tread on the scattered fabric. "Are you hurt?" "No." She gestured around the room. "Just my livelihood." Sullivan's expression hardened as he surveyed the damage. The judge's work? Or his son's? Or anyone eager to curry favor with the Harmons? Eleanor picked up a scrap of ivory satin, all that remained of the wedding dress. It doesn't matter who did it. The message is clear enough. And what message is that? That I should have stayed in my place, that a woman alone shouldn't make trouble. She crushed the satin in her fist, that I'm nothing in this town. Sullivan moved closer, and Eleanor became acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the gun at his hip. Yet she wasn't afraid. Something about his presence steadied her. "You helped the Matthews girl," he said. It wasn't a question. "I stood with her mother while she confronted the judge," Eleanor corrected. "It didn't do any good. Richard Harmon will face no consequences for what he did. And you're facing a summons instead." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "How did you know that?" "As you said, news travels." Sullivan removed his duster and draped it carefully over the back of her overturned chair. Then he began to right her furniture without being asked. "What will you do?" "What can I do? I'll appear as ordered and accept whatever punishment the judge deems appropriate." She tried to keep her voice steady. "Then I'll rebuild. Again." Sullivan paused in his work, a curious expression crossing his face. "Again?" Eleanor looked away. "My father's church burned down when I was 17. We lost everything. I rebuilt then, and I will rebuild now." He was silent for a long moment, then continued, setting her small table upright. "The Harmons have ruled this town too long," he said finally. "They built it," Eleanor replied. "At least that's what everyone says. What? Building something doesn't give you the right to destroy those who live in it." There was an edge to his voice that made Eleanor look at him more closely. In the fading light, his profile was sharp, almost predatory. "Why are you helping me? Mr. Sullivan, you barely know me." He straightened a shelf before answering. "Perhaps I recognize injustice when I see it. There's no shortage of that in the world." "No." His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or a shared weariness. "But not everyone faces it with the courage you showed today." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. No one had ever called her courageous before. Practical, yes. Reliable, competent, but never brave. "It wasn't courage," she said softly, "just anger. Sometimes they're the same thing." They worked together in companionable silence until the worst of the chaos was set right. Eleanor couldn't help noticing the efficiency of his movements, how he handled her belongings with unexpected gentleness. When they finished, her home was tidier, but the destruction was still evident in the slashed fabrics, the broken crockery, the stained walls. "Thank you," she said, as Sullivan collected his duster. "You didn't have to help." "No, I didn't." He settled his hat back on his head. "But I wanted to." Eleanor followed him to the door, uncertain what else to say. The events of the day had left her exhausted, emotionally brittle. Sullivan paused at the threshold. "Miss Winters, I don't suppose you own a gun?" The question startled her. "No, why would I?" "Because the Harmons aren't known for their forgiveness." His gaze swept over her small frame. "And I won't always be around to help set things right." A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "I'll manage, Mr. Sullivan. I always have." He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Lock your door tonight, and if you need anything." He hesitated, then finished. "The hotel. Room 7. With that, he was gone, swallowed by the gathering darkness. Eleanor stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching the space where he had been. Then she closed her door, locked it as he had suggested, and leaned her forehead against the rough wood. Tomorrow she would face Judge Harmon's wrath. Tomorrow she would learn the price of standing up for Mary Matthews. But tonight, in the quiet of her ruined home, Eleanor allowed herself to wonder about Thomas Sullivan, a stranger who had appeared in her shop and then again in her moment of need. a man whose eyes held storms and whose hands bore the scars of violence, yet who had treated her broken things with care. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, a sound so familiar she normally didn't even notice it. But tonight, it seemed to carry a warning, whispering of changes coming to Whispering Pines, changes that had begun the moment Eleanor Winters decided to stop walking small. Dawn broke harsh and unforgiving over Whispering Pines. Eleanor dressed, in her best, a navy skirt and white blouse, both worn at the edges but clean. Her summons was for 9 o'clock. The entire town would be watching. The courthouse square was already crowded when she arrived. Whispers followed her like shadows, but nobody met her eyes. Eleanor held her head high as she climbed the courthouse steps, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Inside, Judge Harmon sat on his bench like a king on his throne. His son, Richard, lounged in the front row, a smirk playing across his fleshy face. Eleanor took her position before the bench, hands clasped to stop their trembling. "Miss Winters," Judge Harmon's voice boomed through the packed courtroom. "You stand accused of slander against the Harmon family and disturbing the peace. How do you plead?" Before Eleanor could answer, the doors swung open. Every head turned as Thomas Sullivan strode in, followed by Reverend Matthews and Sarah, supporting a pale Mary between them. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Judge Harmon demanded. "Just ensuring justice is properly witnessed," Sullivan replied, his voice carrying easily. He removed his hat and stood at the back, leaning against the wall. The judge's face darkened. "Miss Winters, your plea." Eleanor's throat was dry, but she managed to say, "Not guilty, Your Honor." "Very well. Sheriff Wilson, present the charges." The sheriff shuffled forward uncomfortably. "Judge, I was thinking—" "Present the charges," Harmon snapped. As the sheriff recited the accusations, Eleanor saw movement at the courthouse door. 3 strangers entered, hard-faced men with guns at their hips. They spread out along the back wall, eyes fixed on Sullivan. The judge called his first witness, his own housekeeper, who tearfully described Eleanor's vicious attack on the judge's character. Eleanor watched Richard Harmon's smug expression as the woman spoke. His collar was slightly askew, his eyes a bloodshot. He caught Eleanor watching and winked. Rage flared like a match struck in darkness. This man had brutalized Mary Matthews and would face no consequences. And now his father would use the law to punish those who dared speak against them. When Eleanor's turn came to speak in her defense, she stepped forward, back straight. "I am a seamstress," she began quietly. "I sew the clothes that hide your secrets and mend what you tear in your carelessness. I've lived in Whispering Pines my entire life, and in all that time, I've never been seen, truly seen, by any of you." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "What I said to Judge Harmon was truth, not slander. I spoke in defense of Mary Matthews, whose only crime was trusting Richard Harmon when he promised her gifts and kindness." "This is outrageous!" Richard surged to his feet. "The girl's a liar. She came willingly." "So you admit you took her?" Sullivan's voice cut through the chaos. He pushed off from the wall, moving down the center aisle. "You admit you were with Mary Matthews the night she was drugged and violated?" Richard blanched. "I didn't say—" The 3 strangers tensed, hands hovering near their guns. Sullivan appeared not to notice them as he continued toward the front of the courtroom. "Miss Winters," Sullivan called, ignoring the judge's gavel, "what's your Christian name?" Eleanor blinked in confusion. "I don't see how that's relevant. Humor me." "Eleanor." Sullivan nodded, as if confirming something important. Then he turned to face the room. "My name is not Thomas Sullivan. It's Isaiah Blackwood." A collective gasp swept through the courthouse. Even Eleanor recognized that name, a gunslinger whose reputation stretched from Kansas to New Mexico. 15 years ago, Blackwood continued, a church burned down in this town. Inside was the Reverend Jonathan Winters and his wife. Their daughter survived. Eleanor's knees weakened. Nobody in Whispering Pines ever mentioned her parents' deaths anymore. That fire wasn't an accident, Blackwood said, his eyes now fixed on Judge Harmon. It was set by 3 men on orders from someone who wanted the church's land. This is absurd, the judge spluttered. Sheriff, remove this man. The sheriff didn't move. I've spent 15 years tracking those men, Blackwood continued. One died in Colorado, one in Dakota Territory. The third, he nodded toward one of the strangers at the back, just arrived in town with his friends, thinking they were here to kill me. The stranger reached for his gun. In a blur of movement too fast to follow, Blackwood's revolver appeared in his hand. 3 shots cracked through the courtroom like lightning. 3 bodies hit the floor. Women screamed. Men ducked for cover. But Blackwood simply turned back to the judge, gun still smoking. Those men worked for you, Harmon. They burned the church, killed the reverend and his wife, and left their daughter with nothing. No dowry, no protection, nothing but the skills her mother taught her. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The world narrowed to Blackwood's voice and the truth she'd never known. I came to find Eleanor Winters, Blackwood said, holstering his weapon. I came to tell her that her father died protecting evidence against Augustus Harmon, ledgers showing how he stole this town's future. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a worn, charred book. I found this in the church ruins, kept it safe until I could return it to its rightful owner. Eleanor took the book with trembling hands. Her father's handwriting filled the pages, records of bribes, threats, land grabbed from rightful owners. I came for justice, Blackwood said, turning to face Eleanor fully. But I found something else. I found the courage that survived when everything else burned. The courthouse erupted in chaos. Sheriff Wilson finally spurred to action, moved to examine the fallen gunman. Judge Harmon shouted for order, his face purple with rage. But something had broken in Whispering Pines, the spell of fear that had kept the town silent for so long. Sarah Matthews stepped forward. My daughter will testify against Richard Harmon. The baker stood. I'll speak about the judge's threats. When I couldn't pay his special taxes. One by one, townspeople found their voices. In the midst of it all, Blackwood extended his hand to Eleanor. I promised your father I'd find you. I didn't know it would take 15 years. Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand. You killed 3 men today, just to tell me my name. No, he said softly. I killed 3 murderers to restore your name. Eleanor Winters, daughter of Reverend Jonathan Winters, rightful owner of half this town. She took his hand. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.